At 67, Madonna stands as one of the most powerful symbols in music history, yet almost no one knows what her life looks like when the cameras stop flashing. People see the tours, the reinventions, the controversies, the stages built to worship her presence. But behind all of that, there is a woman who has carried a weight the world never saw, a weight that only grew heavier as time passed. For decades, she was the face of rebellion, fearlessness, and dominance. But away from the spotlight, Madonna's journey was marked by quiet battles, heartbreaks that carved themselves into her spirit, sacrifices that fame demanded without warning, and moments of loneliness that even global success could not erase. There were nights when the world assumed she was untouchable, while she was silently fighting to hold on to the very pieces of herself that fame kept taking away. There were victories that looked glamorous from afar, but came with private costs she never spoke of. There were relationships shattered by the intensity of her ambition, dreams built on foundations that nearly crumbled beneath her feet. And now, at 67, the legend who once commanded entire eras faces a truth far more personal and far more fragile than anyone expects. Because the real story of Madonna, the one hidden behind every headline, every performance, every reinvention, is not about fame at all. It is about what she lost to become the woman the world demanded she be. What happened to Madonna when the world stopped watching? What did she endure that history books never recorded? And what chapter of her life, at this age, became the most heartbreaking of all? The answers begin now, and they lead to a truth even her most loyal fans never imagined. To the world, Madonna has always existed as an unshakable force, a woman who turned provocation into poetry, confidence into armor, and rebellion into a global anthem. Her public image is one of relentless strength, a persona sharpened across decades of scrutiny, staged reinventions, and cultural battles no other artist dared to fight. People didn't just see Madonna, they absorbed her. Every era of pop culture carried her fingerprints. Every headline echoed her defiance. Every photograph captured a woman who refused to let time dictate her worth. Fans called her fearless. Critics called her controversial. The industry called her a genius. And in every portrayal, every magazine cover, every televised moment, one message was unmistakable. Madonna was unstoppable. From the very beginning, she shaped herself into a symbol, not just of performance, but of permission. She allowed women to claim their sexuality, claim their ambition, claim their voice without apology. She taught generations how to stand tall in the fire and let the flames make them brighter. Her image became a shield and a weapon at the same time. A shield against a world that tried to mold her. A weapon that shattered expectations and rewrote the boundaries of fame. People saw the glamour, the iconic cone bra, the explosive world tours, the cinematic music videos, the bold political statements. They saw the choreography that felt like electricity, the interviews that felt like confrontation, the album covers that defined entire eras. They saw an artist who turned herself into a mirror of society, and then forced society to look. But they did not see the exhaustion behind the reinventions. They did not see the pressure that came with being a blueprint for rebellion. They did not see the fear of slipping, the terror of becoming irrelevant, the burden of staying ahead in an industry built to devour women once they age beyond its comfort. To the public, Madonna was more than a star. She was a movement, a phenomenon, a storm that never lost its thunder. People believed she thrived in attention, that she lived for resistance, that she was made of an iron certainty that never cracked. But the truth behind that image, the truth the cameras never captured, was far more complicated, far more human, and far more vulnerable. Because while the world celebrated the Madonna they projected, they rarely questioned the Madonna who stood alone backstage, stripped of the persona, carrying the weight of 1,000 expectations. The public image was powerful, but it was also a cage, a beautiful, unbreakable cage built by admiration and reinforced by misunderstanding. And no one knew how heavy that cage had grown until the years caught up, and the woman inside it began to feel the walls closing in, Behind the legend was a life with very little room to breathe. And that private struggle, hidden beneath decades of brilliance, is the real story that now begins to surface. Behind every reinvention, beneath every headline, beneath every layer of armor she presented to the world, there was a Madonna almost no one ever truly met. The hidden self, softer, quieter, more fragile than the icon the world believed her to be. For most of her life, she lived in the tension between who she was expected to be and who she actually was. And in that tension, she carried wounds she rarely spoke of. Wounds that shaped her long before fame amplified them. Away from the cameras, Madonna was not the fearless lightning bolt people imagined. She was a woman haunted by the fear of disappearing. A fear rooted in childhood loss and reinforced by years of fighting for survival in an industry that never stops hunting for the next big thing. The world saw confidence, but she carried insecurities deeper than applause could ever reach. In private, she was contemplative, even lonely at times. The silence of her homes, whether in New York, London, or Lisbon, often revealed the parts of her she kept locked away. She was a mother first, an artist second, and a woman constantly navigating the emotional distance fame created around her. She was fierce in public, but tender with her children. She was outspoken on stage, but introspective at night when the lights went out. She often wrote down her thoughts in notebooks no one else was allowed to read. Words of self-doubt, words of longing, words of gratitude, and sometimes words of grief she never allowed herself to feel fully. There were nights when she removed the makeup, the costumes, the expectations, and simply stared at her own reflection, not to admire it, but to search for the girl she used to be. The one who left home with nothing but ambition, unaware of the storm ahead. Sometimes she wondered if that girl would even recognize the woman she became. Madonna's hidden self was not a symbol, not a rebel, not an icon. She was a human being trying to hold her life together while carrying the weight of an identity the world never let her put down. And beneath the strength she projected, there was a deep and quiet fear. The fear of slowing down, the fear of aging publicly, the fear of being judged more for her years than for her art. Fame had given her everything, but it had also taken something precious, the freedom to grow older without scrutiny. As the years passed, that fear sharpened. Not because she was ashamed of her age, but because she knew how brutal the world could be toward women who dare to age in the spotlight. She felt the shift, the change in how people spoke about her, the tone of the commentary, the unfair expectations placed upon her body, her face, her choices. In secret, she battled the painful truth that the world expected her to remain frozen in time. The Madonna of the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, a timeless figure who wasn't allowed to live like a real person. And yet, behind closed doors, she longed for simple things. Quiet mornings, unguarded conversations, moments of being understood rather than analyzed. The hidden self was where her vulnerability lived, where her memories lived, where her loneliness lived. But it was also where her strength was born, the strength that kept her going long after others would have surrendered. For decades, she hid this part of herself from the world, believing that revealing it would weaken her image. But in truth, this hidden self was the strongest version of Madonna that ever existed, because it was here, in the silence and the honesty, that she faced the battles no audience would ever witness. The battles that shaped her, the battles that scarred her, the battles that prepared her for the heartbreak that would define her later years, the heartbreak the world is only beginning to understand. And now, that hidden self is finally ready to be seen. Long before stadiums screamed her name, before the world crowned her the Queen of Pop, Madonna was simply a determined, restless girl from Michigan, a girl shaped by loss, hunger, and an unshakable belief that she was meant for something greater than the life laid out in front of her. Her story didn't begin with glamour. It began with grief. She was only 5 when her mother passed away, a moment that carved a permanent hollow inside her. That early loss became the quiet engine behind everything she would one day chase. The need to be seen, the need to be loved, the need to survive. She grew up in a house where absence echoed louder than presence, where discipline was strict, where emotions were rarely spoken aloud. Even as a child, she felt like she was standing in a world that expected her to be strong long before she understood what strength meant. Madonna wasn't the loudest child. She was observant, sharp, and always searching for the feeling she had lost. School became the first arena where she learned how to push herself. Dance classes became the second. Movement gave her something she didn't have at home: expression without permission. It was in those dance studios, with mirrors reflecting a determined young girl, that she discovered the power of reinvention. Every step was an escape. Every performance was a declaration that she would not be defined by what she had lost. When she left for New York at 19, she didn't arrive with fame or a future. She arrived with 35 sheer audacity and the kind of ambition that could either make or break a person. New York in the 1970s was unforgiving, and so was her hunger to succeed. She slept in cramped apartments, worked odd jobs, and danced until her feet bled, not because she wanted comfort, but because she wanted purpose. She wasn't looking for fame. She was looking for freedom. Freedom from the shadows of her childhood. Freedom from the silence of Michigan. Freedom from a life where she was expected to stay small. Every rejection hardened her. Every small victory fueled her. She entered the underground art scene with a fearlessness that startled people. She was unapologetic, sharp-tongued, and brimming with ideas that were too bold for the world she had come from. And yet, beneath that boldness, there was innocence, a young woman who had never truly been healed, building strength out of the very wounds she carried. Her origins were not glamorous. They were raw, complicated, and filled with a fire she never allowed to burn out. It was in those early years, among the cramped lofts, the late-night rehearsals, the endless self-belief, that Madonna forged the version of herself the world would later worship. She learned that survival required transformation. She learned that pain could become power. She learned that reinvention wasn't a choice. It was the only path forward. These beginnings shaped her into a force the industry could not ignore. A force born not from fame, but from a lifetime of fighting to exist. And long before the spotlight found her, she was already building the legend the world would one day see. One fierce step, one bold decision, one unbreakable moment at a time. But the spark that would change everything was still waiting to ignite. The moment that would change Madonna's life didn't arrive with applause. It began quietly, like most revolutions do, inside a small room where she was experimenting with sounds, rhythms, and ideas no one had heard before. She wasn't thinking about charts or awards. She was thinking about expression and survival. And somewhere in that tension, something extraordinary ignited. The spark began as curiosity. She picked up a microphone not because she was confident, but because she wanted to see what she could become when no one was telling her who to be. Music was a language she didn't yet understand, but she felt its power instantly. It gave her a different kind of freedom. Not the freedom of movement like dance, but the freedom of voice. For the first time, she felt she could speak to the world without being silenced or ignored. Producers and musicians in the downtown scene quickly noticed her presence. She wasn't the most technically polished, but she was magnetic in a way that couldn't be taught. She brought energy into a room the moment she stepped inside it. She had an instinct, a sharp, fearless instinct, for what people wanted before they even realized it themselves. Her spark became a flame the day she recorded her early tracks, pieces that would later evolve into the beginnings of her signature sound. These weren't polished songs. They were raw, pulsing with hunger, filled with the kind of ambition that feels almost dangerous. People who heard her early demos didn't just hear a voice, they heard intent. They heard someone preparing to change the rules. The spark also came from her refusal to be boxed in. She wasn't trying to fit into the music industry, she was trying to break into it with a shape of her own. She blended underground dance rhythms with pop hooks. She mixed innocence with defiance. She performed with a boldness that felt both rebellious and inviting. Everything about her demanded attention, even before she wanted it. There was a night, one she would remember for the rest of her life, when she stepped onto a small stage in a crowded New York club. The room was hot, packed, and buzzing with the unpredictable energy of a city that devoured artists daily. But when she started performing, all the noise, all the movement, all the chaos shifted. People turned. People stared. People listened. Not because she was perfect, but because she was undeniable. Something clicked in that moment. Something inside her recognized that she was standing at the edge of a life-changing transformation. She knew she wasn't going back to who she had been before. In that tiny room, with a crowd of strangers watching her move and hearing her voice for the first time, the spark became a blaze. She felt the beginning of a destiny she had chased since Michigan. A destiny made not from luck, but from the fire she had carried since childhood. Her ambition sharpened, her vision crystallized. She was no longer searching for a path. She was building one. What the world would eventually call the rise of Madonna started here, in these fragile early moments of discovery. Moments fueled by risk, moments fueled by pain, moments fueled by a determination that bordered on obsession. She didn't yet know how far this spark would take her. She didn't know the heights she would reach. She didn't know the price she would pay, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Her life was about to change forever. And once the spark turned into a fire, nothing, not doubt, not critics, not fear, would ever stop her again. The breakthrough didn't happen overnight, but when it arrived, it hit with a force that even Madonna wasn't fully prepared for. It began with a single song, a track that carried her voice, her energy, and her fearlessness into the world beyond New York's underground clubs. Everybody was more than a debut. It was an introduction to a presence the industry had never seen before. The response was immediate. People felt something different in her sound, something vibrant, something rebellious, something alive. The dance floors lit up. Clubs pulled the track into heavy rotation. DJs who had never heard her name suddenly couldn't get enough of her pulse, her rhythm, her audacity. And behind the scenes, Madonna felt a shift deep inside her chest. This was no longer a dream. It was a beginning. Her breakthrough accelerated when she signed her first major record deal. It was the validation she had fought for, starved for, and refused to settle without. But for Madonna, a contract was not a victory. It was an opening. An open door she planned to sprint through with everything she had. Then came the moment that changed the trajectory of her life, the release of her first album. The world didn't just listen, it reacted. Her songs became anthems. Radio stations played her voice on loop. Young women saw power in her defiance. Young men admired her confidence. Critics couldn't decide whether she was a genius or a disruption. But they all agreed on one thing: she could not be ignored. Her image exploded into pop culture. The bangles, the lace, the bracelets climbing her arms, the tousled hair, the sharp glance, the attitude that felt both innocent and dangerous. She didn't just enter the spotlight, she stormed it. But her true breakthrough arrived with the release of Like a Virgin. Overnight, she became a global phenomenon. The music video rewrote the rules. The performance at the MTV Awards became a cultural earthquake. She walked across the stage in a wedding dress, daring the world to judge her. And the world did. Some were shocked. Some were thrilled. But all of them were watching. That was the moment she understood her power. She realized she had the ability to provoke conversation, shift culture, and challenge boundaries with a single gesture. She wasn't simply performing. She was reshaping the way fame operated. Her confidence wasn't an act. It was a weapon she had forged from every rejection, every hardship, every moment she had felt small in her life. Her albums climbed the charts. Her tours sold out. Her name became more than a name. It became a headline. And yet, in the middle of all the noise, Madonna did something rare. She refused to stop evolving. She didn't want to be a one-hit wonder, or a cultural moment, or a temporary spark. She wanted to become a force that couldn't be replaced. So she transformed again, and again, and again. Each reinvention raised the bar. Each era defined a new chapter in pop culture. But the breakthrough brought more than success. It brought scrutiny. It brought judgment. It brought expectations so heavy they could crush anyone unprepared. Still, she kept rising. Still, she kept pushing. Still, she kept proving that she wasn't just meant for the spotlight. She was born for it. This was the era when the world crowned her. This was the era when she became an icon. This was the era when fame wrapped itself around her so tightly that she no longer had the option to live a normal life. Her breakthrough had elevated her beyond anything she imagined. But it also began the long, painful process of losing pieces of herself to the image she created. And as her star climbed higher, she had no way of knowing how steep the cost of greatness would one day become. By the time the world reached the late 80s and early 90s, Madonna was no longer just a rising star. She was the undisputed ruler of an empire she had built with nothing but ambition, instinct, and an iron will. The crown didn't arrive as a gift. She seized it. And once it was hers, she held it with a grip that defined an entire generation. This was the era when her influence became global, when her name became synonymous with cultural revolution. Every move she made, musical, visual, personal, carried weight. Presidents referenced her. Scholars analyzed her. Parents worried about her influence while their children imitated her every gesture. She wasn't simply famous. She was inevitable. Her albums dominated the charts. Her tours became spectacles on a scale no female performer had ever dared to attempt. Her image was everywhere, on billboards, magazine covers, television screens, and stadium posters. And yet, what truly defined her crown was not the attention, but the authority she commanded. Madonna became the standard, the blueprint, the bar every other artist was forced to measure themselves against. Her voice wasn't the only thing shaping culture. Her choices did. Her risks did. Her refusal to obey did. She changed fashion not by following trends, but by obliterating them. She changed conversations about female sexuality by refusing to whisper when the world demanded silence. She changed the expectations of what a woman in the industry could do, and more importantly, what she didn't have to apologize for. Madonna's crown wasn't made of gold or jewels. It was made of controversy, courage, and conviction. It rested not on her head, but on every boundary she broke. Her confidence became a global phenomenon. Her vulnerability became a secret she hid even from herself. The crown elevated her above the noise, but it also isolated her. Because as her power grew, so did the distance between her and the world around her. People admired her, idolized her, obsessed over her, but few understood her. She became the most visible person on the planet, and also one of the most misunderstood. The crown came with endless demands, endless interviews, endless expectations, endless pressure to remain perfect, provocative, and untouchable. There were nights when she returned to empty hotel rooms after electrifying performances, the cheers still echoing in her ears, only to feel the quiet reality of her life settle heavy on her shoulders. The crown sparkled on stage, but behind closed doors, it weighed like stone. Still, she pushed forward. Still, she reinvented herself. Still, she rose higher. She embraced motherhood, shocking people who believed she was too wild, too independent, too controversial to nurture a child. But motherhood didn't weaken her image. It reshaped it. It added depth to her identity, warmth to her edges, humanity to the legend the world treated like a lightning bolt. She conquered film. She conquered fashion. She conquered entire cultural narratives. And all the while, she kept chasing the next transformation, the next idea, the next version of herself the world wasn't ready for, but would eventually accept because she demanded it. This was the height of her reign, the era when Madonna's influence wasn't just powerful, it was absolute. But as with every crown worn too long, the weight begins to leave marks. And while the world celebrated her dominance, Madonna began to feel the first quiet warnings of what she would one day face. The cost of being a symbol in a world that rarely allows symbols to age, falter, or simply be human. Her crown made her immortal in the eyes of millions, but it also marked the beginning of battles that no amount of fame could shield her from. At the height of her empire, when the world believed Madonna had everything, fame, power, control, legacy, she was quietly learning the truth that every legend eventually confronts. Nothing in life comes without a price, and the higher the climb, the more brutal the cost. Her success looked effortless from the outside, but behind the perfection was a life built on sacrifice. The first price she paid was privacy. By the time she reached global superstardom, she could no longer walk down a street without becoming a spectacle. Cameras followed her like shadows. Rumors spread faster than the truth. Every relationship she formed, friendship, romance, mentorship, became public property the moment it touched her life. Strangers wrote stories about her emotions as if they owned them. Critics dissected her choices as if they raised her. The world demanded access to her humanity while refusing to treat her like a human being. The second price she paid was her body. She pushed it beyond limits most performers would never dare to cross. Tours that lasted for months. Rehearsals that stretched into dawn. Choreography that punished muscles and bones until they screamed. Madonna refused to slow down because slowing down felt like surrender. And so she trained her body like a warrior, disciplined, relentless, unyielding. But the years didn't care about her discipline. The injuries began. The exhaustion deepened. The recovery time expanded. Her body aged like every human body does, but the world judged her for it as if aging were a failure. They criticized her looks, her surgeries, her decisions, her outfits, cruelty disguised as commentary, misogyny disguised as concern. No artist in her position had ever been forced to endure this level of scrutiny over time itself. The third price was emotional. Being Madonna meant being strong even when she felt weak, being unshakable even when she was breaking. She carried the weight of an empire while navigating heartbreaks, betrayals, and losses that rarely stayed private. Every time she tried to show vulnerability, the world twisted it into a headline. Every time she tried to rest, people mistook it for decline. She had spent decades fighting to be seen, and now she was fighting not to be destroyed by the gaze she once commanded. The fourth price was isolation. Success can build walls around a person faster than failure ever could, and for Madonna, those walls rose high. Friends changed, relationships strained. She became surrounded by people who worked for her, depended on her, admired her, but very few who truly understood her. Real conversations became rare. Authentic affection became complicated. Trust became fragile. Eventually, she found herself in a paradox only the truly famous experience, surrounded by millions yet deeply alone. The fifth price was internal, the pressure to remain Madonna, to remain revolutionary, to remain shocking, to remain relevant, to remain ageless, to remain untouchable. She had built a persona so powerful, so iconic, that even she struggled to live up to it. And with every passing year, the world's expectations intensified. People wanted her to be the Madonna of the past, the fire, the rebellion, the lightning, without understanding that the woman behind the icon was evolving, hurting, growing older, and searching for peace. But perhaps the most devastating price she paid was the one no one saw coming. The emotional toll of staying strong for so long began catching up with her. Moments of exhaustion turned into moments of doubt. Moments of doubt turned into quiet nights filled with questions she never had time to ask before. Had she given too much? Had she fought too hard? Had she sacrificed pieces of herself she would never get back? And what would the world do if she ever allowed herself to slow down, even for a moment? These weren't questions the Queen of Pop was ever supposed to ask. But they were the questions that began haunting her when the spotlight dimmed, when the cameras stopped clicking, when the world turned its attention to newer, younger faces. The price of being Madonna was not just the loss of privacy or youth or simplicity. It was the slow erosion of a life lived entirely in service of an identity the world refused to let her outgrow. And as the years passed, the price only grew heavier, slowly setting the stage for the fall that no one, not even Madonna herself, saw coming. Her 67th year arrived not like a quiet sunset, but like a storm breaking open the sky. From the outside, people still saw Madonna as an icon wrapped in armor, a woman who moved through decades as if time itself had no permission to touch her. But inside the walls of her home, she felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before: fragility. Her mornings began with a ritual she didn't advertise. She would walk barefoot across the cold tiles of her hallway, passing framed photographs of the years when everything looked electric, unstoppable, untouchable. The shots of world tours, award nights, magazine covers, and packed stadiums once felt like proof that she had conquered life. But now, at 67, each picture looked like a reminder of how much she had lost to get there. She paused at one frame in particular. It was a younger version of herself, standing on a stage with lights blazing all around her hair wild, her expression fierce and alive. She touched the glass lightly. She whispered, not loudly, but with a tremor that came from somewhere deep, "I know you're still in there." But the reflection staring back at her looked tired. The world had changed faster than she could adjust. The culture she once led now moved without waiting. The sound, the style, the rules, the audience, everything had shifted. And for the first time in her entire career, she felt the world drifting ahead of her. There were mornings when she didn't want to rehearse, afternoons when her voice felt thin, nights when she lay awake wondering if people loved her for who she was, or just for who she had been. She didn't share these feelings with anyone, not her team, not her children, not the world. She kept them tucked behind the same thick walls she had used since her 20s. But pressure has a way of cracking even the strongest stone. A few close friends noticed the change. She wasn't moving with the same certainty. She wasn't stepping into rooms the way she used to. She wasn't absorbing energy. She was losing it. One friend asked her gently, "Are you okay?" Madonna only nodded. The truth was far heavier. She didn't feel okay. She felt like she was carrying decades of expectation on her shoulders, and every year added another invisible weight. Behind the scenes, health struggles began to appear more often than headlines ever reported. Small things at first: fatigue, joint pain, breathing that felt shorter after long rehearsal days. She pushed through them the way she always had. But pushing through stopped working. There was a day during rehearsals when she walked off stage halfway through a run. Her team panicked. She raised a hand to silence them, trying to hide how much her chest was pounding. She said only, "Give me 5 minutes." But she didn't take 5. She took an hour, sitting alone on the floor of her dressing room, staring at her trembling hands. She kept telling herself, "I have survived everything. I can survive this too." But deep down, she knew this was different. This wasn't a scandal or a headline or a feud or a world criticizing her choices. This was her own body telling her something she did not want to hear. In private, she began writing letters. Not to publish, not to keep, just to get the weight out of her chest. Some were written to her children, thanking them for their love even when she didn't know how to show hers properly. Some were written to people she had drifted away from. Some were written to herself, the version of her that had fought from the streets of New York to global superstardom. Those letters were full of apologies. She apologized for pushing herself too hard, for burying her feelings under ambition, for believing that success could replace comfort, for thinking applause could replace connection, for ignoring the places where her heart had split. She wrote one sentence over and over. "I don't know how to stop." It was the truest confession she had ever put on paper. As months passed, she tried to slow down, but slowing down for someone who had lived in motion for 4 decades felt like a kind of death. Resting made her restless. Being still felt like falling. Taking a break felt like disappearing. Her children tried to convince her to breathe, to step back, to heal. She listened, but only halfway. Her ambition was still louder than her exhaustion, until the day her body finally overruled her. She had been preparing for a performance that mattered deeply to her. A moment she wanted to prove, to herself more than anyone, that she still had the fire. She rehearsed too hard, too long, too relentlessly. That night, her legs gave out beneath her before she even reached the final chorus. Her team rushed to her, but all she could whisper was, "Just give me a second." Her voice shook. Her breath wouldn't steady. The room felt like it was spinning out from under her feet. They took her to rest, but the fear in her eyes was something new. Not fear of failure, not fear of critics, not fear of aging. It was the fear of losing herself. She had spent a lifetime building a version of Madonna that the world believed was indestructible. But the woman beneath that armor was fragile, vulnerable, deeply human, and exhausted from years of carrying an image too heavy to sustain. Her medical team urged her to take a real break. Not a few days, not a week. A full stop. A pause she had avoided her entire life. Her children insisted too. One of them held her hand and said, "We don't need the performer, we need you." For the first time, she felt torn between the legacy she had created and the life she had been neglecting. She realized she had been running so long that she didn't know how to just be. To slow down felt like surrender, but to keep going felt like self-destruction. The world had no idea what she was going through. People saw headlines, but not the shaking hands. They saw outfits and stages, but not the worry in her children's eyes. They saw a legend, but they didn't see the woman who stayed up at night wondering if she had spent her entire life giving too much to the world and not enough to the people who truly mattered. Her 67th year became the year she faced the truth she had been outrunning. She had built a kingdom, but she had forgotten to build a home inside herself. And in the quiet of those long nights, she realized something even more painful. The world might still be loud, demanding, unforgiving, but the true battle she was fighting was no longer external. It was the battle between the icon the world needed and the human being she had finally allowed herself to be. She knew something had to change. She just didn't yet know how. After the breaking point, Madonna retreated into a silence that the world would barely notice, because her public image had always been one of presence, energy, and noise. The applause, the lights, the cameras, all had created the illusion that she was everywhere at once, untouchable, unstoppable. But for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to exist without performance. The silence began quietly. She canceled tour dates she had been planning for months. Meetings that were once non-negotiable were postponed or refused. Interviews, photo shoots, collaborations, all were set aside, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. She needed stillness. She needed space. She needed herself. It was the first time in over 40 years that the world didn't demand a reaction from her every hour. And in that absence, she confronted the pieces of her life she had long ignored. She revisited memories that fame had buried. Childhood moments in Michigan, moments with her mother before her death, the quiet fear that had always lingered in her chest. She sat with those memories not as fuel for her ambition, but as reflections of her humanity. Pain was no longer something to convert into music, fashion, or headlines. It was simply pain. Her days became slower. Mornings began with long walks through quiet streets, where she could feel her body move without choreography. She watched the wind ripple across trees and thought about how impermanent everything was. The tours, the fame, even the spotlight she had built her life around. And for the first time, she realized that impermanence was not a threat, but a freedom. The silence was also filled with reflection on the people she had loved and lost along the way. Lovers, friends, collaborators, relationships that had burned bright and then vanished. She thought about the choices she had made, the ambition that had required sacrifice, and the moments she had neglected her own emotional needs. She thought about her children, the ones who had grown up in a world where their mother was often unreachable, physically present but emotionally distant. She thought about how she had tried to compensate with gifts, guidance, and protection, but how much she had missed just being there. She questioned herself, sometimes harshly. Had the price of fame been worth the moments she couldn't reclaim? The silence also forced her to confront aging, something she had danced around her entire life. Madonna had always been celebrated for her ability to defy age, to reinvent herself at any stage, to maintain power and relevance when others faded. But in this silence, she saw herself without the adornments of stage lights, high heels, or the energy of fans. She saw her reflection in its rawness. Lines etched from laughter and worry, hair tinged with silver, hands that had shaped music and dance but now carried quiet tremors. For the first time, she allowed herself to grieve the years she could never get back. She mourned the sleepless nights, the broken relationships, the parts of herself sacrificed for success. And yet, in that mourning, there was clarity. She discovered that silence was not emptiness. It was presence. It was honesty. It was a mirror reflecting everything she had ignored while the world was applauding her brilliance. She began writing again, not songs or scripts or autobiographies for publication, but journals, private letters to herself, notes to her children, letters to the younger Madonna she had once been. She wrote about fear, exhaustion, loss, and regret, but also about resilience, strength, and hope. The process was both painful and healing. She faced the truth she had long avoided, that ambition, while intoxicating, could be isolating, that fame, while intoxicating, could erode intimacy, that power, while intoxicating, could sometimes feel like a cage. In the quiet, she also re-examined her artistry. She realized that reinvention had always been her survival mechanism, the way she protected herself while continuing to create. But survival without reflection was no longer enough. She needed to create not only to be seen, but to be understood. Not only to influence, but to express. Her silence was interrupted only by moments of insight. Sometimes she would play piano for hours, letting her fingers search for melodies that had no destination other than her own peace. Sometimes she would sketch ideas for performances she might never stage, imagining art without expectation. Sometimes she simply sat, breathing, listening to the sound of her own thoughts. She also began reconnecting with people she had distanced herself from, not in public but privately. Friends who had witnessed her rise and been sidelined in her pursuit of perfection. Collaborators who had grown wary of her intensity. Family members she had inadvertently pushed away. Slowly, cautiously, she rebuilt bridges she had long neglected. Madonna realized that her silence was teaching her a lesson she hadn't learned in all the years of noise, that life, without constant performance, was not emptiness. It was fullness. That her identity was not bound solely to her achievements. That she could exist without applause, without headlines, without validation. That she could simply be. It was during these months of retreat that she faced her deepest vulnerability. She allowed herself to cry without restraint, to feel doubt without shame, to admit fatigue without guilt. She discovered that courage was not only in the spotlight, but in the quiet moments of acceptance. Yet the silence was also confronting. It forced her to confront mortality, to question how long she could continue performing, how much energy she had left to give, how long her body would endure the demands of a life built on movement, reinvention, and spectacle. She confronted the fragility she had long denied. But Madonna's silence was not defeat. It was preparation. It was reflection. It was recalibration. In this period, she understood that the world would always see her as a legend, as an icon, as a persona larger than life. But she could finally see herself as a woman, whole, imperfect, evolving, and deserving of rest. And in that realization, she found a new form of strength, not the raw, explosive power that had built her empire, but the quiet, enduring strength of self-knowledge, acceptance, and the courage to be vulnerable in ways the world would never witness. Her silence became a sanctuary. It became a space for healing. It became a place where Madonna could finally reclaim the parts of herself lost in the decades-long pursuit of brilliance. For the first time in her life, she discovered that stepping back, listening, and observing did not make her smaller. It made her stronger. It made her wiser. It made her ready for the next chapter of a life that was far from over. Despite the heartbreak, despite the exhaustion, despite the pressure of a world that would never stop expecting more. In that silence, she realized something she had never known before. True power is not measured by visibility or applause. It is measured by presence, by authenticity, by the ability to survive, to feel, and to continue moving forward when the world believes you should have already stopped. Madonna emerged from that silence with a quiet confidence that no stage, no camera, no audience could ever replicate. It was internal. It was unshakable. It was hers alone. And while the world would still see her as the unstoppable queen of pop, Madonna now understood that the woman behind the crown had survived far more than the public could ever imagine. She had endured the price of fame. She had faced her own fragility, and she had returned from the silence stronger than she had ever been. The silence had been long, painful, and confronting, but it had given her something no spotlight ever could: herself. After months of silence, Madonna began the slow process of returning. Not to the world she had dominated, but to herself. This return was not about reclaiming her crown, proving her relevance, or chasing headlines. It was about reconnecting with the energy, creativity, and passion that had first ignited her life. It was about finding the balance between the icon the world revered and the human being she had long neglected. She started with small steps: private rehearsals in an empty studio, testing choreography she had imagined during the quiet months. She didn't perform for anyone, not even for her team. The music became her own again, unfiltered, uncompromised, free from the expectation to impress or shock. These sessions were almost ritualistic. She moved with care, feeling the weight of her body and celebrating its resilience. Every stretch, every spin, every note she hit reminded her of the power she had cultivated over decades. But it was different now. The power was tempered by wisdom. The performance was infused with introspection. The expression was personal, not performative. Her children noticed the change first. She was calmer, present in ways she hadn't been before. Conversations that had once been interrupted by schedules, interviews, and obligations became uninterrupted. She listened, she observed, she engaged. And in this return, she realized that the love she gave her family did not need to compete with her fame. They were no longer extensions of her empire. They were the heart she had been ignoring. But her return was not limited to private spaces. Madonna began meeting with collaborators, not to chase trends or chart success, but to explore art that resonated with her own evolving identity. She sought musicians, directors, and dancers who understood depth, narrative, and emotion. She wanted work that challenged her intellectually and emotionally, rather than simply propelling her fame. This new approach startled some people in the industry. Executives used to her lightning-fast decisions and relentless energy were cautious. Critics who had watched her evolve for decades were curious. Fans were confused at first. Why was she retreating from spectacle? Why was she focusing on substance over sensation? But slowly, they began to understand. Madonna's return was not a loud announcement. It was deliberate, measured, intentional. It was a re-emergence that prioritized her well-being, her creativity, and her relationships over every other metric. She began collaborating on music that reflected her current life experiences. The themes were nuanced: loss, reflection, resilience, aging, and love in its many forms. Lyrics carried weight. Melodies held introspection. The dance was still there, but it was purposeful, telling stories that required attention rather than simply dazzling eyes. This shift was also evident in her performances. The tours she launched were not just showcases of energy, but journeys through narrative and emotion. The lighting, the choreography, the music, all were orchestrated to tell a story, to invite audiences into her perspective rather than simply offering spectacle. She challenged herself to connect on a level deeper than ever before. Critics who had once dismissed her as a provocateur began to recognize the evolution. They saw the depth that fame had long overshadowed. They saw a woman willing to expose her vulnerabilities while commanding her craft. The return wasn't just about regaining attention. It was about reclaiming artistic integrity. Madonna also used this period to mentor younger artists. She understood the pitfalls of fame in ways few could teach. She guided them not only in performance and ambition, but in preserving emotional and mental health. She emphasized longevity over speed, substance over style, and authenticity over expectation. Through this, she found another layer of fulfillment, shaping the future of music while redefining her own presence in it. Her return was also personal. She reconnected with old friends, rekindled relationships that had faded under the weight of her previous ambition, and sought moments of joy outside her career. She traveled quietly, sometimes alone, sometimes with family, not for publicity, but for reflection. Museums, small towns, historical sites, each became a sanctuary, a space to absorb life without performance. In this return, Madonna confronted aging openly for the first time. She no longer fought against it as a threat, but embraced it as a process of evolution. Her performances, her music, her art reflected this understanding. She was older, wiser, and more deliberate. She had traded impulsive reinvention for purposeful transformation, but the return wasn't without struggle. The world still expected spectacle. Fans still demanded the old Madonna, the defiant, unrelenting, invincible icon. Critics still scrutinized. Some nights she questioned herself. Had she slowed down too much? Had she lost the spark that once set her apart? Could she remain relevant on her own terms? She learned that relevance wasn't dictated by charts or applause, but by authenticity. Her power wasn't in outrunning time, but in moving with it. She discovered that audiences, even after decades, could connect with truth, depth, and vulnerability, if she allowed herself to offer it. In her quietest moments, she would sit and reflect on the journey, the girl from Michigan, the struggling dancer in New York, the queen of pop who had conquered the world, and the woman now emerging from silence. Each version of herself was a layer, and each layer carried lessons, regrets, triumphs, and wisdom. She realized that the return wasn't about reclaiming the past. It was about integrating it, taking the fire of her youth, the lessons of her crown, the wisdom of silence, and forging a new era that honored all of herselves. Her creativity flourished in ways it hadn't before. She began experimenting with forms beyond music, film, visual art, writing, exploring storytelling with a depth she had rarely prioritized. She understood that influence was no longer about domination of the charts or headlines, but about meaningful impact that lasted. Fans began to notice the change. They felt it in her music, in her performances, in her interviews. They felt the honesty, the reflection, the human presence she had long hidden behind armor and spectacle. And in response, a new appreciation emerged. Not for the Madonna of headlines and controversy, but for the Madonna who had endured, evolved, and returned with purpose. Through this process, she redefined success for herself. It was no longer about awards, records, or numbers. It was about creativity that resonated, relationships that were real, and a life that was sustainable. She began to understand that the crown she once fought so hard to hold could now rest lightly because she no longer needed it to define her worth. Her return also carried a message for the world, a testament that resilience is not linear, that stepping back is not weakness, that evolution is a lifelong journey. Madonna's story was no longer just about fame. It was about survival, transformation, and reinvention with integrity. By the time she appeared on stage again for a carefully chosen performance, it was clear to everyone. This was not a comeback in the traditional sense. It was a statement that Madonna had survived everything the world and her own ambition had thrown at her. She had returned not to reclaim an old identity, but to claim a life she had nearly forgotten existed, her own. Every note she sang, every movement she made, every word she spoke carried not the weight of expectation, but the weight of authenticity. Audiences responded not just to the icon, but to the woman behind the icon. A woman who had confronted fear, endured heartbreak, navigated the pressures of fame, and emerged wiser and stronger. In her return, Madonna discovered that legacy isn't built only in the spotlight. It's built in the choices we make when no one is watching, in the courage to confront ourselves, in the willingness to evolve without apology. And as she stood quietly on a stage with only her voice, her presence, and the audience's attention, she understood. The return was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of the most meaningful chapter yet, one defined not by spectacle, but by truth, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of herself. Madonna's return was complete, not as the unstoppable force the world imagined, not as the lightning bolt the world chased, but as a woman who had learned the hardest truths, survived them, and now moved forward on her own terms. The return was not loud. It was not flashy. It was enduring. It was real. It was hers. And in that reality, she found something more powerful than fame, more enduring than applause, and more precious than any crown she had ever worn: peace within herself. Madonna's story is not measured in the number of albums sold, the tours conquered, or the awards collected. Her legacy is measured in influence, the kind that transcends charts, decades, and headlines. It is a legacy that redefined the possibilities for every woman, every artist, and every individual, daring to assert herself in a world that often refuses to make space for audacity. Her influence is woven into the fabric of modern culture. From fashion to music, from film to social commentary, the echoes of her innovations are visible everywhere. Artists cite her as inspiration, scholars dissect her career, and critics still attempt to understand how a single human being could command such enduring attention. But beyond the statistics and the accolades lies a subtler, deeper impact, the courage she instilled in others to embrace themselves fully, to challenge norms, and to speak their truth. Madonna's legacy begins with transformation. She reinvented herself constantly, refusing to remain static, and in doing so, she showed the world that identity is not a fixed concept. Every era of her career, the pop provocateur, the spiritual seeker, the reflective artist, demonstrated a willingness to evolve, even at the cost of criticism and misunderstanding. She proved that change is not weakness but power, that reinvention is not betrayal but survival. She also challenged boundaries in ways that were unprecedented. Madonna was unapologetic about her sexuality, her voice, her choices. She introduced topics to the public discourse that others avoided. She demanded attention not for frivolity, but for awareness, discussion, and reflection. Her fearlessness opened doors for future generations of performers who would step onto stages with confidence and authenticity, knowing someone had paved the path before them. Her work reshaped the perception of women in the entertainment industry. For decades, women had been expected to conform, to shrink, to avoid controversy. Madonna shattered those expectations. She embraced agency over her career, authority over her image, and ownership over her narrative. She demonstrated that femininity and power could coexist, that a woman could be sensual, assertive, creative, and independent without apology. Her influence extends beyond artistry into the lives of millions who found inspiration in her story. She represents perseverance, someone who rose from humble beginnings in Michigan, faced countless obstacles, and ascended to a global stage. Her story is not just about fame. It is about resilience, tenacity, and the refusal to be silenced. She became a mirror for anyone who had ever been underestimated, told no, or doubted their own worth. Madonna's legacy also carries lessons of imperfection and vulnerability. Her journey was never linear. She faced heartbreak, public scrutiny, professional setbacks, and personal doubts. But she confronted them openly, in music, in performance, and later in reflection, teaching the world that struggle is part of greatness, that fragility is not shameful, and that survival is itself a triumph. In the later years of her life, her legacy became more intimate, more personal, and perhaps more profound. The years of silence, reflection, and careful return were not about reclaiming headlines, but about understanding herself and influencing the world in ways that mattered. She mentored younger artists, shared insights on resilience, and showed that longevity in the industry is as much about self-preservation and authenticity as it is about talent. Her children carry fragments of her legacy too. Through them, her influence extends into the next generation, not only genetically, but through values, lessons, and examples of courage. They witnessed her highs and lows, her victories and vulnerabilities, and in doing so, they internalized the lessons of perseverance, authenticity, and ambition tempered with care. Globally, Madonna's legacy is reflected in the countless artists who followed in her footsteps. Women and men alike who drew inspiration from her fearlessness, her creativity, and her refusal to conform. Her name is synonymous with innovation and rebellion. She shifted pop culture, not only with hits and performances, but with the very way people think about art, identity, and personal expression. Yet perhaps the most enduring part of Madonna's legacy is the narrative she left for herself. She survived the heights of fame and the depths of solitude. She confronted aging, scrutiny, and personal fragility. She found strength in silence, resilience in reflection, and courage in return. Her story is a blueprint not only for artists, but for anyone who seeks to live fully, confront fear, and embrace change. Her legacy is multidimensional. It is the Madonna the world saw, provocative, daring, unrelenting. And it is the Madonna the world rarely saw, vulnerable, reflective, human. It is the story of a woman who built an empire and then built herself, who redefined what it means to be powerful, and who continues to influence generations through both her public presence and her private wisdom. Even now, at 67, she is a living testament to perseverance, reinvention, and the enduring power of authenticity. Her name, her work, her example, and her influence will continue to ripple outward, inspiring individuals to challenge limits, embrace their truth, and rise despite the pressures of a world that often demands conformity. Madonna's legacy is not just measured in what she accomplished, but in the courage she gave to others. It is a legacy of audacity, resilience, and transformation. It is a legacy that proves that greatness is not defined solely by accolades or wealth, but by the ability to endure, evolve, and inspire. And while time will continue to move, her influence will remain. She showed that life is not about perfection, but about movement, evolution, and authenticity. She proved that an individual can change the world not by fitting in, but by standing apart. The story of Madonna, the Queen of Pop, is not merely one of music and fame. It is a story of survival, reinvention, and enduring relevance. It is a story of humanity in the midst of legend, and it is a story that will continue to inspire, challenge, and provoke for generations to come. Her life beyond the spotlight, once heartbreaking and isolating, has become a testament to resilience and the power of introspection. Madonna's legacy is complete, not in perfection, but in the truth of her journey. A journey that transformed not only her life, but the world around her. She is, and will always be, a symbol of courage, reinvention, and enduring artistry. And the world will remember her not just as the Queen of Pop, but as a woman who survived, evolved, and taught the world the true meaning of legacy. Madonna's story reminds us all that fame is fleeting, applause is temporary, and glory can fade. But the courage to persist, to transform, and to embrace oneself fully is immortal. The legacy she leaves is not just in the music, the tours, or the spectacle. It is in the human truth that survives long after the lights go down. The triumph of survival, self-realization, and unwavering authenticity. Madonna's life, in its full scope, the spark, the crown, the price, the silence, and the return, is now cemented as a story for the ages. A story that transcends entertainment, that teaches resilience, and that inspires courage in all who witness it. Her legacy is living proof that greatness is not solely in the spotlight, but in the struggle behind it, in the authenticity of survival, and in the courage to rise again, even when the world expects you to fall. And that is the story that will endure. Madonna. At 67, her life beyond the spotlight is heartbreaking, yet inspiring. Thank you for watching. Please Please subscribe to Talksberry and comment. Remember, greatness isn't in the spotlight, but in the struggle behind it.